Don't touch me. The words came out low, controlled, but sharp enough to slice through the polished silence of the 42nd floor boardroom as Edward Harrington pulled his hand back just inches before Naomi Carter's fingers could meet his, and for a second her hand stayed there in midair, suspended between gesture and rejection. The overhead lights reflecting faintly off her skin while a soft ripple of laughter moved around the long glass table like a passing draft, subtle but unmistakable. Chairs creaking, someone clearing their throat, someone else tapping a Montblanc pen against a leather notebook. And Naomi didn't flinch, didn't rush to withdraw, didn't let the moment rush her. She simply held it, the weight of it, the quiet insult dressed as casual indifference, and then slowly lowered her hand as if nothing had been taken from her at all, her posture straight. Shoulders relaxed beneath a charcoal blazer that still carried the faint scent of rain from outside, the city stretching below them and muted, gray through floor-to-ceiling windows, and Edward leaned back in his chair, one ankle resting over his knee, expression calm but edged with something colder, something practiced, as if this was not the first time he had dismissed someone without raising his voice. "Let's not waste time," he said, glancing briefly at the others who nodded along, some avoiding eye contact, others watching Naomi with thin curiosity, measuring her, placing her, deciding her worth before she had spoken a word. And Naomi stepped forward, placing her tablet gently on the table, the soft click echoing louder than it should have in the quiet room, her reflection staring back at her from the glass surface, steady, composed, and for just a flicker of a second, something older passed through her mind, a memory of standing in a lobby downstairs 2 years ago, security asking for ID twice while others walked through without pause, the same building, the same polished marble floors, the same invisible line she had crossed to stand here now, and she let that memory settle, not as anger, but as fuel. "I didn't come here for permission," she said evenly, her voice not loud but anchored, drawing just enough attention to shift the air, and a few heads turned, the laughter fading into something tighter, more alert, Edward's eyes narrowing just slightly as if recalibrating, not impressed, but no longer dismissive enough to ignore her completely, and Naomi tapped the screen, bringing up her first slide, numbers clean, precise, projections mapped across 5 years with a clarity that didn't beg for validation. It demanded comprehension, and she spoke without rushing, each word placed carefully, like stepping stones across a river she knew by heart. "This platform reduces operational loss by 32% within the first 18 months, she said, her finger gliding across the data, and scales without increasing overhead beyond projected margins. And the room didn't react immediately, but something subtle shifted, a board member leaning forward, another adjusting his glasses, someone scrolling quickly on a tablet to cross-check figures, and Edward remained still, but his gaze lingered longer now, not on her face, but on the screen, and Naomi continued, unbroken. "We're not asking for entry," she added, her tone unchanged. "We're offering leverage." And for the first time, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was dense, layered with calculation, with doubt, with the quiet realization that something had just entered the room that didn't fit the assumptions made 5 minutes earlier, and Naomi paused, just long enough to let it breathe, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, fingertips steady, no tremor, no hesitation, and somewhere behind her, the faint hum of the building's ventilation system seemed louder now, filling the gaps between thoughts, and Edward exhaled slowly, tapping his finger once against the armrest, the smallest signal that the balance in the room had shifted, even if only by an inch, and Naomi met his gaze, not challenging, not pleading, just present, as if she had been here all along, and they were only now catching up to that fact. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, like pressure building behind glass, and one of the board members, a man in his late 50s with silver hair and a navy suit that fit too precisely, leaned forward just enough for his chair to whisper against the floor, his eyes narrowing at Naomi's screen as his fingers hovered over his tablet, scrolling, cross-checking, pausing, then scrolling again, and he cleared his throat softly, not to interrupt, but because something in the numbers refused to be ignored. "These margins," he said carefully, not looking at her yet, "they assume a supply chain compression that we could not achieve last year." And Naomi did. not rush to respond. She let the question settle in the room, let it hang long enough for others to hear the implication beneath it, because it was not doubt, it was recognition, and then she nodded once. You could not, she said, her tone steady, not correcting him, not challenging, just placing the fact between them. Because you were using a legacy model that depends on third-party aggregation. And she tapped the screen again, zooming into a section of the projection. We eliminated that layer entirely, and the man blinked, just once, a small, involuntary reaction, while another board member shifted in her seat, leaning closer, her pen no longer tapping but still, focused, and the room tightened further, the earlier laughter now distant, replaced by something quieter and far more dangerous, attention, and Edward watched all of it without moving, his expression unreadable, but his fingers had stopped tapping, his posture slightly less relaxed, as if something in the air had changed temperature without anyone announcing it. And Naomi continued, her voice never rising, never pushing, just unfolding. We built direct vendor integration across 3 regions, she said, pilot tested over 12 months, with measurable loss reduction starting at month 4. And she paused, not for effect, but because she knew the next line would land differently. You tried to buy this system last year, she added, her eyes moving briefly toward the silver-haired man, then back to the screen, but the version you saw was incomplete, and a subtle ripple moved through the table, not sound, but movement, shoulders adjusting, eyes lifting, someone sitting up straighter, and the man who had spoken earlier exhaled slowly, almost inaudible. That explains the discrepancy, he murmured, more to himself than anyone else, and Edward finally leaned forward, just slightly, his gaze now fixed directly on Naomi, no longer drifting to the screen, no longer scanning the room, but studying her, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, but edged with something sharper than before. You are assuming a level of scalability that most companies fail to sustain past initial deployment, he said, and the room stilled again, waiting, because this was not dismissal, not yet, this was pressure, and Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. I am not assuming, she replied, her voice quiet but firm. I am showing you the data, and she turned the tablet slightly, angling it toward him, not as an offering, not as a request, but as evidence, and for a brief moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the city far below and the soft buzz of electricity in the overhead lights, and Edward's eyes flicked to the screen, scanning quickly, then back to her, and something in his expression tightened, not enough for anyone else to name it, but enough to register. And one of the younger board members, a man who had not spoken yet, shifted forward, his voice hesitant but clear. If this holds, he said, this changes our position in the market by at least 18% within 2 fiscal years. And no one laughed this time. No one dismissed it, because the number was not small. It was not theoretical, it was specific, and Naomi did not react, did not smile, did not claim victory. She simply stood there, grounded, as if the room catching up was inevitable, and Edward leaned back again. But it was different now, less relaxed, more deliberate, as if recalibrating in real time. And he glanced briefly around the table, reading the shift in his own board, seeing the hesitation, the interest, the subtle alignment beginning to tilt. And then he looked back at Naomi, his voice smooth again, but colder now. Numbers can be persuasive, he said, but presence matters at this level. And there it was, not shouted, not explicit, but placed carefully, like a line drawn just beneath the surface, and a few eyes dropped. Others stayed fixed on the table, and Naomi felt it, not as surprise, but as confirmation, the boundary that had been there from the moment she walked in, and she did not react to it, not outwardly. She did not defend, did not argue, did not step back. She simply held his gaze, steady, unblinking, and said, then it is a good thing I did not come here for presents. And the room went still again, not frozen this time, but suspended, as if something unseen had just shifted into place, and no one was quite ready to name it yet. The air in the room did not move. It tightened, like every breath had been paused at the same time, and Naomi did not look away, not from Edward, not from the table, not from the weight of what had just been said, because she understood something most people in that room did not. that power was not always loud. It was often quiet, controlled, and patient, and she had learned long ago how to stand inside that silence without shrinking, and Edward studied her now with a different kind of attention, not dismissive anymore, but searching, as if trying to locate the exact point where his expectations had failed him. And one of the board members shifted again, this time more noticeably, leaning toward the person beside him and whispering something that did not stay contained, because the word acquisition floated just enough above the table to be heard, and another voice followed, softer. If she already scaled phase 2, then this is not early stage. And Naomi heard it. All of it. The recalculations, the quiet reassessments, the subtle movement of interest that replaced the earlier amusement. And she did not interrupt. She did not rush to claim the shift. She let it happen, because forcing it would weaken it. And Edward's jaw tightened slightly, just enough to register that the room was no longer entirely his, and he leaned forward again, this time placing both hands flat on the table, the glass surface reflecting the tension in his fingers. "Let us be clear," he said, his voice smooth but heavier now. "You are asking this board to trust projections that have not yet been tested at scale within our ecosystem." And Naomi nodded once, acknowledging the frame without accepting its limitation. "No," she said, her tone unchanged. "I am offering you access to a system that has already proven itself outside your ecosystem." And that word, outside, landed differently, because it implied something none of them were used to hearing, that value could exist beyond their reach, beyond their control, and the room felt it, the shift from evaluation to realization. And one of the directors, the same silver-haired man, leaned back slowly, exhaling through his nose as if releasing a conclusion he had not expected to reach so quickly. "If this data is accurate," he said, louder this time, no longer a whisper, "then we are not looking at a risk. We are looking at a missed opportunity." And the words hung there, heavier than anything that had been said before, because they did not question Naomi, they questioned the room itself, and Edward's eyes flicked toward him, sharp, assessing, but he did not interrupt, not immediately, because he knew the moment mattered. And Naomi stood still, her hands resting lightly at her sides now, no longer touching the table, no longer needing to anchor herself to anything in the room, because the center had shifted, subtly, but undeniably, and she felt it, not as triumph, but as alignment, as if the truth she brought with her had finally found its place in the space around her. And Edward straightened, adjusting his cuff with a slow, deliberate motion, buying himself a second, maybe two, to reassert control, and when he spoke again, his tone had changed, not softer, but more precise, more calculated. "Even if we consider your model viable," he said, "there are factors beyond data that determine who sits at this table." And there it was again, the boundary, quieter now, but still present, still drawn, and this time, no one laughed, no one shifted in agreement, because the room had already begun to move past it. And Naomi saw that. She saw the hesitation, the discomfort, the awareness that something outdated had just been spoken into a space that no longer fully supported it. And she took a single step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to close the distance between her and the table by a few inches, and she said, "Then it is fortunate that I am not asking for a seat." Her voice steady, unshaken. "I am offering you a decision." And the words settled into the room with a different kind of weight, not defensive, not reactive, but final. And for a brief moment, no one spoke, not because they had nothing to say, but because they were measuring what had just been placed in front of them. Not just the numbers, not just the model, but the reality that the power dynamic they had assumed at the beginning of this meeting was no longer holding, and Edward felt it. Even if he did not show it fully, the subtle erosion of control, the quiet shift of attention away from him and toward her, and he leaned back once more, slower this time, his gaze fixed on Naomi as if trying to decide whether to challenge, to dismiss, or to adapt, and the room waited, suspended again, not frozen, but balanced on the edge of something that had not yet been named, something that was about to tip, but had not fallen yet. Edward did not answer immediately, and that pause stretched longer than any silence before it. Not empty but charged, like the moment just before a storm decides whether to break or pass. And his eyes remained fixed on Naomi, studying her not as an interruption anymore, but as a variable he had not accounted for. And around the table the shift became more visible now, subtle but undeniable. One director leaned back with arms crossed not in dismissal, but in thought. Another tilted her screen slightly toward herself, rechecking figures that had already begun to settle into certainty. And the earlier confidence that had filled the room when Naomi first walked in had thinned into something more cautious, more aware, and Edward finally moved, not abruptly, but with measured intent, his fingers pressing lightly against the glass before he stood. The soft scrape of his chair against the floor echoing just enough to pull every eye back to him, reclaiming the center of the room even as it resisted him. "Let us not confuse momentum with position," he said, his voice calm, controlled, but carrying farther now, filling the space with practiced authority, and a few heads nodded instinctively, not because they fully agreed, but because they were used to following the rhythm of his leadership. And Naomi watched him without interruption, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady, as if she had expected this moment, not as an obstacle, but as a necessary step in the unfolding of something larger. And Edward walked slowly along the side of the table, not pacing, but repositioning, placing himself where he could see both Naomi and the board at once, a calculated angle, a reminder that he still understood the room better than anyone else, or at least he believed he did. "Data can create interest," he continued, "but alignment determines execution." And he paused just long enough for the words to settle, for the implication to take shape, that what Naomi offered might be impressive, but it did not belong here, not fully, not yet. And that was where he intended to hold the line. And for a brief second, the room hovered again, caught between two gravitational pulls, one rooted in habit, in hierarchy, in everything that had defined their decisions before today, and the other, quieter but growing, rooted in numbers that refused to be ignored, in a presence that did not ask for permission to exist. And Naomi let that tension breathe. She did not rush to fill it, because she understood that silence, when used correctly, could expose more than any argument. And one of the younger directors shifted forward again, this time more decisively, his voice no longer hesitant. "With respect," he said, glancing between Edward and Naomi, "if her projections hold, then alignment is exactly what we are looking at." And the words landed differently this time, not as a suggestion, but as a challenge, subtle but clear. And Edward's gaze flicked toward him, sharp, assessing, measuring whether this was a moment to correct or to contain. And Naomi saw it. The fracture, small but real, the first visible sign that the room was no longer moving as one. And she took a breath, slow and controlled, and stepped slightly to the side, not retreating, but shifting her position so that she faced the entire table, not just Edward. And when she spoke, her voice carried evenly, not louder, but fuller, as if it had settled into the space around her. "You are right," she said, her eyes moving briefly toward Edward, acknowledging his point without conceding it. "Alignment determines execution." And she let that sit for half a second, just long enough to signal that she was not avoiding the argument, but stepping into it. "Which is why I built this. Outside your system," she continued, her tone steady. "Because your system could not support it." And the words did not explode. They settled, heavy and precise, and the effect was immediate, not loud, but visible, a tightening of shoulders, a stillness that replaced movement. And Edward's expression did not change dramatically, but something in his posture shifted, a slight adjustment that suggested he had not expected that line to land as cleanly as it did. And one of the directors exhaled, softly, almost a laugh, but not quite, more like recognition breaking through restraint. And Naomi did not press further. She did not layer the moment with explanation or justification. She let it stand, because she knew the power of what had just been said was not in how loudly it was delivered, but in how clearly it could not be dismissed. And Edward remained still for a moment longer, then slowly straightened, his hands moving to adjust his jacket, a small, controlled motion that masked the recalculation happening behind his eyes. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but sharper, more focused. "And yet you are here," he said, not as a question, but as a statement meant to reframe the narrative, to pull the center back toward him. And Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, and for the first time, there was the faintest hint of something beneath her composure, not doubt, not anger, but certainty, settled and unshaken. "No," she said, her voice calm, grounded. "I am not here for entry." And she paused, just long enough for every eye in the room to find her again. "I am here to show you what you are about to lose." And the room did not react immediately, not with sound, not with movement, but the silence that followed was different, deeper, as if something irreversible had just been set into motion, and no one in that room could quite pretend they had not felt it. No one spoke after that, not immediately, because the weight of her words did not invite interruption. It settled into the room like something permanent, and Naomi did not move, did not shift her stance or adjust her expression. She simply stood there as if she had already said everything that needed to be said, and the board felt it, the difference between a pitch and a warning, between someone asking for approval and someone presenting a reality that would continue with or without them. And Edward remained still for a moment longer, his eyes locked on Naomi, not with dismissal now, not even with skepticism, but with something more calculated, something quieter, as if he was tracing the edges of a situation that had slipped beyond his initial control. And then he exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, and turned slightly toward the table, breaking the direct line between them just enough to shift the focus back to the group. "We are not in the business of reacting to pressure," he said, his tone measured, steady, designed to restore order, and a few heads nodded again, reflexively. But the agreement did not spread the way it had earlier. It stayed contained, hesitant, because the room had already begun to move past that rhythm. And one of the directors, the same silver-haired man, tapped his pen once against the table, then stopped, as if deciding whether to speak. And finally he did, his voice calm but firmer now. "This is not pressure," he said, looking directly at Edward. "This is timing." And the distinction landed with precision, because it reframed everything, not as a challenge to authority, but as an opportunity that did not wait. And Naomi heard it, recognized it for what it was, the first clear shift of alignment in the room. And she did not react outwardly, but something inside her settled further, deeper, as if the ground beneath her had just become more solid. And Edward's jaw tightened slightly, just enough to register that the narrative was no longer fully his to control. And he turned his head back toward Naomi, his gaze sharper now, more focused. "If what you are presenting is as advanced as you claim," he said, "then you would not be standing here without a reason." And it was not a question, it was a test, an attempt to locate the leverage, to find the angle that would return the advantage to him. And Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, her posture unchanged, her voice steady. "You are right," she said, and for a brief second, the room leaned into that agreement, expecting concession, expecting explanation, but she did not give either. She let the moment hold, just long enough to draw their attention fully back to her. And then she continued, "There is a reason," and she paused again, not for effect, but because she understood the value of timing, the way a single beat could shift the weight of a sentence. "I wanted to see if you would recognize it." And the room went still again, not frozen, but focused, every eye on her now, because that line did not ask for approval. It evaluated them, and Edward's expression did not change dramatically, but something in his posture shifted, a slight forward lean, a narrowing of his gaze, as if the frame of the conversation had just tilted in a way he had not anticipated. And one of the younger directors exhaled quietly, almost a laugh, but held it back, because the moment did not allow for release. It demanded attention, and Naomi took a small step back from the table, not retreating, but creating space, as if she no longer needed to occupy the center to control it. And she reached for her tablet, closing the presentation with a soft tap, the screen going dark, reflecting the room back at itself. And that simple motion changed everything, because it signaled an ending, not of the conversation, but of her need to prove anything further. And the board felt it, the subtle shift from evaluation to consequence. And Edward watched her closely now, not speaking, not interrupting, because he understood that something was about to happen, something that would either restore his control or remove it entirely. And Naomi held the tablet at her side for a moment, her fingers steady against its edge, her expression calm, and then she said, You have been evaluating whether this belongs here. Her voice even, grounded. But you have not considered whether you still qualify to be part of it. And the words did not rise. They settled, precise and final, and the room did not move. Not a chair, not a pen, not a breath loud enough to be heard. Because that line had crossed something invisible, something that could not be undone, and Edward's gaze locked onto hers, the space between them no longer defined by distance or hierarchy, but by a question neither of them had spoken yet. And for the first time since the meeting began, the outcome no longer felt like something he could dictate, but something he would have to face. The room did not release the tension after her words. It absorbed them, like something too heavy to drop, and for a moment no one moved. Not even the assistants near the walls, not even the quiet shifting of papers or screens. Everything held, suspended between what had just been said and what had to come next, and Naomi did not rush to fill that silence. She allowed it to deepen, because she understood that the most powerful moments were not created by speaking more, but by knowing when to stop. And Edward remained standing, his posture still composed, but no longer effortless. There was a precision to it now, a calculation behind every small movement, his fingers resting lightly on the back of his chair, as if anchoring himself to something familiar, something stable, and his gaze stayed on Naomi, not challenging, not dismissive, but searching, measuring, as if he was trying to locate the exact point where the structure of this meeting had shifted beyond his reach. And finally he spoke, his voice quieter than before, but sharper, more deliberate. "You are making a very confident assumption," he said, and the words were controlled, but they carried an edge, not of anger, but of resistance, the last line of a position that had not fully given way. And Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady, as if she had already accounted for this moment long before she walked into the room. And she did not respond immediately. She let his words settle, let the room feel the weight of them, and then she said, "No," her voice calm, grounded. "I am observing a pattern," and the distinction landed differently, because it did not argue, it clarified, it shifted the frame from opinion to evidence, and a subtle movement passed through the board, not sound, but awareness, a few heads turning slightly, a few eyes narrowing in thought, and one of the directors leaned forward again, his hands clasped now, no longer hiding behind a screen. "What pattern?" he asked, and the question was not defensive, it was genuine, because the room had already begun to see it. They just had not named it yet, and Naomi turned her head slightly toward him, acknowledging the question, but not shifting her stance, not losing the center she had established. "Every time something falls outside your system," she said, her tone even, "you do not evaluate it, you hesitate." And she paused, just long enough for the implication to register. "And hesitation at this level is not caution," she continued. "It is loss." And the words settled into the room with a different kind of weight, because it was not abstract, it was measurable, it was real, and the silver-haired director exhaled slowly, his eyes dropping briefly to the table before lifting again, as if confirming something he had already begun to accept. And Edward's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, because he understood the truth beneath her words, even if he was not ready to concede it. And he straightened, releasing his grip on the chair, stepping forward just enough to reclaim a fraction of the space between them. "We do not hesitate," he said, his voice firmer now, reclaiming some of its earlier authority. "We assess." And the correction was subtle, but intentional, a reassertion of control, of narrative, of identity. And Naomi nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "Then assess this," she said, and there was no challenge in her tone, no escalation, just clarity, and she reached into her bag, not hurried, not dramatic, but precise, and pulled out her phone, holding it at her side for a moment, her fingers steady against its edge, and the room watched, not because they understood what she was about to do, but because they felt that something had shifted again, something quieter but more decisive. And Naomi glanced briefly at the screen, her eyes scanning for a second. Then she lifted her gaze back to the table, to Edward, to the board, and said, "While you were deciding whether I belong here," her voice calm, controlled, "others were deciding whether you still lead." And the words did not rise. They settled, and before anyone could respond, before the room could reorganize itself around that statement, she tapped the screen once, a single, deliberate motion, and then lowered her hand slightly, waiting, not speaking, not explaining, because she did not need to, and the room held its breath again, not in confusion, but in anticipation, as if something invisible had just been set into motion, something that would reach them all at the same time. And Edward's eyes flicked briefly to the phones on the table, then back to Naomi, and for the first time, there was the faintest trace of uncertainty in his gaze, not visible enough for anyone to name, but present enough to be felt, and the silence stretched, thinner now, sharper, like a wire pulled tight. And then, almost at once, a soft vibration broke through it, followed by another, and another, phones lighting up across the table, screens flickering to life in unison, and no one spoke, not yet, because they were still looking at her, still trying to understand what had just begun, even as the evidence started to appear in their hands. The vibration did not stop after the first wave. It spread, one device after another lighting up across the polished glass surface, screens glowing cold blue against the muted gray of the room, and for a moment no one reached for them, as if touching the message too quickly might change what it said, and Naomi did not move, did not look down at her own phone again, because she already knew what was there. She had read it before stepping into this room, and Edward's gaze shifted, just slightly, from her to the nearest screen, then to another, calculating, tracking the reaction before it even formed, and finally one of the directors picked up his phone, slow, deliberate, as if the weight of it had increased, and his eyes scanned the message once, then again, his posture tightening as the meaning settled in, and another followed, and another, the room breaking its stillness not with noise, but with realization, each person pulling their device closer, each face changing in small, controlled ways, a brow tightening, a jaw setting, a breath held just a second too long, and the silence that followed was no longer neutral. It was charged, filled with something undeniable, and Edward remained standing. But the balance had shifted, not dramatically, not visibly to an outsider, but enough that the center of the room no longer aligned with him, and he reached for his own phone, not hurried, not reactive, but precise, as if even this moment had to be handled with control, and when he looked at the screen, his expression did not break, not outwardly, but something behind his eyes recalibrated, a quick, sharp adjustment that he masked almost instantly, and Naomi watched him. Not with satisfaction, not with triumph, but with a quiet certainty, as if this outcome had never been in question, and one of the younger directors spoke first, his voice lower than before, but clearer. 3 billion, he said, almost under his breath, but the number carried, echoing softly against the glass and steel, and another voice followed, confirmed, and a third, multiple firms, and the words did not overlap. They built, one on top of the other, forming a structure of understanding that the room could not ignore, and Naomi let them speak, let the information settle from their mouths instead of hers, because it carried more weight that way, and Edward lowered his phone slowly, placing it back on the table with a soft, controlled motion, and for a moment he said nothing, because the space between what he had expected and what had just occurred was too wide to cross immediately, and the board looked at him now, not waiting for direction, but watching for response, and that difference was subtle, but it mattered. It shifted the expectation from leadership to accountability, and Edward straightened, adjusting his jacket again, a familiar motion, a practiced reset, and when he spoke, his voice was steady, but there was a new edge beneath it, something tighter, more focused. Funding does not guarantee execution, he said, and the line was clean, controlled, an attempt to reframe, to narrow the impact of what had just been revealed, and Naomi nodded once, acknowledging the point without conceding anything. Correct, she said, her tone even, but it guarantees direction, and the distinction landed immediately because it moved the conversation forward instead of pulling it back, and one of the directors leaned forward again, his voice more urgent now. If those firms are in, he said, glancing around the table, then we are already behind. And no one disagreed, not out loud, not with a nod, not even with a glance, because the truth of it had already settled into the room, and Edward felt it. The shift from control to reaction, from authority to response. And for the first time, the question was no longer whether Naomi belonged there, but whether they could afford to let her leave. And Naomi stood still, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, as if none of this had altered her position, because in her mind, it had not. This was not a victory. It was a confirmation, and she reached down, picking up her tablet again, not to reopen it, but to hold it. A small, grounded motion that signaled readiness, not urgency. And then she looked at Edward, directly, without hesitation, and said, "You asked why I am here." Her voice calm, measured. "This is why." And she let the words sit, not pushing them, not expanding on them, because the evidence was already in their hands, glowing on their screens, impossible to dismiss. And the room did not respond immediately, because it could not. Not yet. It was still adjusting, still recalibrating around a reality that had shifted faster than anyone expected, and Edward held her gaze for a moment longer. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, not agreement, not defeat, but recognition that the balance of power had changed, and that whatever came next would not follow the rules that had defined the beginning of this meeting. The room did not return to normal after that. It reorganized itself, quietly, almost invisibly, but in a way that everyone could feel, and Naomi did not step forward or speak again immediately. She allowed the shift to complete without interference, because she understood that forcing the moment would weaken it. And across the table, the board members were no longer glancing at their screens with curiosity. They were studying them with intent, scrolling, rereading, cross-checking the sender. Names, the timestamps, the confirmation lines that left no room for interpretation, and one of them leaned back slowly, his fingers still holding the phone as if it had become something heavier than a device. "These are not soft commitments," he said, his voice measured but unmistakably different now. "These are executed agreements." And another director nodded, more openly this time. No hesitation, no attempt to mask it. "That means she is not raising capital," she added. "She has already secured it." And the distinction landed with weight, because it erased the last assumption that Naomi was here to ask for anything. And Edward heard it. Every word, every shift in tone, every movement that signaled the room was no longer aligned with him in the same way. And he did not interrupt, not immediately, because he knew the timing mattered, that speaking too quickly would expose more than it controlled. And instead he walked slowly back to his chair, lowering himself into it with deliberate calm, reclaiming the position even as its meaning changed. And he placed his hands together on the table, fingers interlocked, a posture of control, of thought, of measured response. And when he finally spoke, his voice was even, but there was a weight behind it that had not been there before. "Then the question is not whether this works," he said, his gaze moving briefly across the board before returning to Naomi. "It is where it goes." And the room quieted again, not out of uncertainty, but because the frame had shifted, the conversation no longer about validation, but about direction, about alignment, about who would move forward with what had already begun. And Naomi listened, her expression steady, her posture unchanged, as if she had anticipated this transition from the beginning, and she nodded once, acknowledging the shift without claiming it. "Exactly," she said, her voice calm, grounded, "and that decision has already been made." And the words did not rise. They settled, clear and final, and a ripple of tension moved through the room. Not confusion, but realization, because the implication was no longer subtle. It was direct, and one of the directors leaned forward again, his voice sharper now. "Are you saying we are not part of it?" he asked, and the question carried a different kind of urgency, not authority, but concern. And Naomi turned her gaze toward him, steady, composed. "I am saying you were given the first look," she replied, "not the final say." And the distinction was precise. It did not accuse, it clarified, and the room felt it. The shift from control to opportunity, from ownership to participation, and Edward's expression tightened slightly, not visibly to anyone untrained, but enough to register that the narrative was no longer his to define alone, and he leaned forward, his voice lower now, more focused. "And yet you are still here," he said, echoing his earlier line, but with a different weight, a different intent. as if searching for the remaining leverage in a situation that had already begun to move beyond him. And Naomi met his gaze, her eyes steady, her tone unchanged. "Because I believe in efficiency," she said, and she paused, just long enough for the room to register the shift. "And it is faster to show you than to explain it later." And a faint exhale moved through the table, not laughter, not relief, but recognition, because the moment had crossed into something else entirely, something that no longer resembled a pitch. And Naomi took a small step back, not retreating, but creating space, signaling that her role in this phase was complete, and she reached for her bag, her movements unhurried, controlled, as if the outcome did not depend on what she did next. And that was what changed everything. Not the funding, not the numbers, but the absence of need, and the board felt it. The difference between someone asking to be included and someone deciding who would be allowed in. And Edward watched her closely now, not with dismissal, not even with resistance, but with a measured awareness that the balance had shifted in a way that could not be undone. And the room held that awareness, quietly, collectively, as if waiting to see who would move first. And Naomi paused with her hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, her fingers steady, her posture unchanged, and for a brief moment, the entire space seemed to narrow to that single point, that single breath before the next decision would be made. Naomi did not pull her hand away from the table immediately. She let it rest there for just a second longer, her fingertips barely touching the cool glass, as if grounding herself in a moment that had already shifted beyond anything it had been when she walked in. And across from her the board remained still, not frozen, but focused. Every person in that room now aware that the decision they thought they were making had already been made somewhere else, without them. And the realization carried a quiet weight, heavier than any raised voice or sharp objection could have. And Edward watched her closely, his gaze steady, not confrontational, not dismissive, but searching, as if trying to identify the exact point where control had slipped from something he directed into something he now had to respond to. And for the first time since the meeting began, he did not speak immediately. He allowed the silence to stretch, to test whether it would bend back toward him or continue moving in her direction. And it did not bend. It held, anchored by something stronger than presence or position. And one of the directors shifted in his seat, not out of discomfort, but out of urgency, leaning forward with his hands now flat against the table, no longer hidden behind a screen or folded into stillness. "If we are not part of this," he said, his voice controlled but carrying an unmistakable edge, "then we need to understand what we are losing." And the question did not challenge Naomi. It acknowledged her. It placed her at the center of the outcome rather than at the edge of approval. And Naomi turned her head slightly toward him, her expression unchanged, her voice calm. "You are not losing access," she said. "You are losing priority." And the distinction landed clean, precise, because it reframed everything again, not as exclusion, but as position, as timing, as sequence, and the room absorbed it quickly, the implications unfolding in real time across faces that had grown sharper, more alert, more aware of what delay now meant. And another director spoke, this time without hesitation. "Priority determines terms," she said, almost to herself, but loud enough to be heard. And Naomi nodded once, acknowledging the truth of it without claiming ownership, because it was no longer something she needed to argue. It was something they were beginning to say for her. And Edward leaned forward slightly, his hands separating now, palms resting against the table, not defensive, not closed, but deliberate, as if he was choosing his next words with care rather than habit. "Then, let us be efficient," he said, his tone measured, steady, but different now, stripped of the earlier assumption. What would it take to restore that priority? And the room shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to register that the question had changed, from evaluation to negotiation, from authority to alignment. And Naomi held his gaze for a moment, not rushing to answer, because she understood the weight of what he had just done, the subtle but clear repositioning of himself from gatekeeper to participant. And she took a slow breath, her shoulders steady, her posture unchanged, and said, "It is not something you restore," her voice even, grounded. "It is something you recognize before it moves on." And the words settled into the space between them, not as rejection, but as truth. and Edward did not interrupt, did not push back immediately. Because he understood that pressing against that line would not shift it, it would only confirm it, and the board watched quietly, collectively, no longer waiting for him to lead, but watching to see how he would adapt. And Naomi stepped back slightly from the table, her hand leaving the glass completely now, her presence no longer anchored to any single point in the room, because she did not need to hold the space. It was already holding her, and she reached into her bag again, not hurried, not signaling departure, but preparing, as if the next step had already been decided long before this conversation reached its current shape, and the room felt it. The difference between a negotiation that was open and one that was closing, and one of the directors leaned forward again, his voice lower now, more focused. "If we move now," he said, glancing briefly at Edward before looking back at Naomi. "Is there still a path forward with us?" And the question carried a different weight than any before it. Not authority, not skepticism, but intent. And Naomi met his gaze, her expression steady, her tone unchanged. "There is always a path," she said, and she paused, just long enough for the room to lean into what came next. "But it does not wait." And the words did not rise, they settled, final in a way that did not need to be emphasized, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was defined, shaped by the understanding that whatever happened next would not be about convincing her, would be about deciding whether they could keep up with what had already begun moving beyond them. And Edward sat there, his posture still controlled, but his stillness now carried a different meaning, not dominance, but calculation, as if he was measuring not just the deal, but the cost of every second that passed without action. And Naomi stood across from him, calm, composed, already aligned with a future that did not depend on the outcome of this room. Edward did not answer right away, and that delay carried more weight than any immediate response could have. Because for the first time since the meeting began, he was no longer deciding how to control the room. He was deciding how to keep up with it. And his eyes remained on Naomi, steady, calculating, as if measuring not just her position but the speed at which everything had shifted around her. And the board felt it, the hesitation, subtle but real, the kind that does not come from uncertainty, but from recalibration. And one of the directors leaned forward again, his voice lower now, more focused. "We do not have the luxury of watching this move without us," he said, and this time no one disagreed, not even silently, because the message on their screens had already removed that option. And Naomi stood still, her posture unchanged, her presence grounded, as if the urgency in the room did not belong to her. Because it did not, it belonged to them now, and Edward finally moved, his fingers tapping once against the table, a small, controlled motion, before he spoke. "Then we act," he said, his tone firm, reclaiming a measure of authority not through dismissal, but through decision. And he turned slightly toward the board, not fully away from Naomi, but enough to signal that he was addressing the room as a whole. "If priority is what is at stake, then we secure position immediately." And the words carried weight, not as command, but as alignment, as if he was shifting himself to meet the moment rather than resist it. And a few heads nodded, more decisively this time, the hesitation that had lingered earlier replaced by a clearer direction. And Naomi watched him, her expression steady, not surprised, not impressed, just observant, as if this was the outcome she had expected from the moment she walked in. And Edward turned back to her, his gaze direct. "You said it does not wait," he continued. "So let us not wait." And the line was clean, controlled, an attempt to close the distance that had opened between them. And Naomi held his gaze for a moment, her eyes steady, her voice calm. "Speed does not replace timing," she said, and the distinction landed immediately, because it reminded the room that action alone was not enough, that direction still mattered. And one of the directors exhaled softly, almost a nod following it. "Then what is the timing?" he asked, and this time the question was not cautious, not hesitant. It was direct, because the room had already accepted that Naomi was the one who defined it. And she did not answer right away. She let the question settle, let the attention gather fully around her again, and then she said, "The timing was before this meeting," her tone even, grounded. And the words did not rise, they settled, precise and final, and a ripple of realization moved through the table, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable, because it confirmed what they had already begun to understand, that this moment was not an opening, it was a narrowing, and Edward's jaw tightened slightly, not in frustration, but in recognition, and he leaned back a fraction, his posture still composed, but now carrying a different weight. The weight of a position that had to adapt rather than define, and he studied her for a second longer, then said, "And yet, you are still here," his voice quieter now, more focused, as if searching for the remaining space in a situation that had already begun to close, and Naomi nodded once, acknowledging the truth of that observation without shifting its meaning. "Because there is still one decision left," she said, and the room stilled again, not out of confusion, but anticipation, because the line carried something more than information, it carried direction, and one of the directors leaned forward, his hands no longer resting but gripping the edge of the table lightly. "What decision?" he asked, and Naomi met his gaze, her expression steady, her voice unchanged. "Whether you want to be included," she said, and she paused, just long enough for the room to absorb it, "or whether you want to explain later why you were not." And the words settled with a quiet finality that did not need emphasis, because the implication was already clear, and Edward held her gaze, not speaking immediately, because this was no longer a moment he could control with timing alone. It required something else, something closer to acknowledgement, and the board waited, not for his authority, but for his response, because the balance in the room had shifted in a way that could not be undone, and Naomi stood there, calm, composed, already aligned with whatever came next, whether it included them or not. No one moved after her words, not immediately, because the choice she had just placed in front of them did not allow for casual reaction. It demanded clarity, and the room felt it. The narrowing of options, the quiet realization that hesitation was no longer neutral. It carried consequence, and Edward remained still for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on Naomi, not with resistance now, not even with calculation alone, but with something deeper, recognition, and it was subtle, not visible in his posture or his tone yet, but present in the way he did not look away, the way he allowed the silence to hold without trying to break it too quickly, and the board watched him, not waiting for instruction anymore, but watching for alignment, and that difference shifted the weight of the moment entirely, and Edward exhaled slowly, the sound controlled, measured, and then he leaned forward, placing both hands on the table, not as a display of authority, but as a grounding point, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but more precise. "We will not be explaining later," he said, and the line did not carry the same certainty it would have at the beginning of the meeting. It carried intent, and that was enough, and a few heads nodded, more firmly now, the hesitation that had lingered earlier dissolving into decision, and one of the directors spoke up quickly, his voice aligned with the shift. "Then we move now," he said, and another followed. "We formalize terms before the window closes," and the room began to move, not chaotically, but with direction, with purpose, devices being picked up, notes being adjusted, the subtle mechanics of action beginning to replace the stillness of observation. And Naomi watched it without interruption, her expression unchanged, because she understood that this movement did not come from her pushing. It came from them catching up, and Edward turned his attention back to her, his gaze steady, no longer searching for weakness, no longer testing, but meeting her at the level she had established. "If inclusion is still on the table," he said, his tone controlled, "then we proceed with alignment." And the phrasing was deliberate, not asking, not demanding, but positioning himself within the framework she had defined. And Naomi held his gaze for a moment, not rushing to respond, because she understood the weight of that shift, the quiet acknowledgement embedded in his words, and she nodded once, not as agreement, but as recognition. "Alignment requires clarity," she said, her voice calm, grounded, "and clarity requires terms." And the lines settled into the room like a structure, something solid, something actionable. And one of the directors leaned forward again, already reaching for a notepad. "Then let us define them," he said, his voice focused, and the board followed. The earlier distance between them and Naomi now replaced by engagement, by urgency, by the understanding that this was no longer about evaluation. It was about participation, and Edward remained steady, his posture composed, but now aligned with the movement rather than apart from it. And he gestured slightly toward the table, a small, controlled motion that signaled readiness rather than command, and Naomi stepped forward just enough to meet the shift, not closing the distance entirely, but entering it. And she placed her tablet back on the glass surface, not to reopen the full presentation, but to bring up a single page, clean, minimal, structured, and the board leaned in, not out of curiosity, but intent, and Naomi spoke, her voice even, measured. "These are the conditions for entry," she said. And the words carried weight not because they were loud, but because they were final, and Edward's eyes moved. Briefly to the screen, then back to her. And for a moment there was no tension in his expression, no resistance, just focus. And he nodded once, a small motion, but one that carried more meaning than anything he had said earlier, and the room felt it. The shift from control to alignment complete, and Naomi continued, not rushing, not filling the space with unnecessary detail, just outlining what needed to be understood, what needed to be decided, and the board listened, not interrupting, not questioning immediately, because the dynamic had changed, and for the first time since the meeting began, the conversation moved forward without friction, without resistance, guided not by authority alone, but by clarity, and Edward remained there, present, engaged, no longer trying to redefine the moment, but participating in it, and Naomi stood across from him, steady, composed, not elevated, not lowered, just equal in a way that did not need to be stated, because it had already been established in everything that had just unfolded. Naomi did not rush through the terms. She let each one settle into the room with the same measured precision she had carried from the beginning, her voice steady, unhurried, as if time no longer pressured her, because she had already stepped beyond it. And the board followed closely now, not interrupting, not second-guessing, but absorbing, writing, calculating. Their earlier skepticism replaced by a focused urgency that showed in the way they leaned forward, the way their eyes stayed locked on the screen, and Edward listened without speaking, his posture composed, his hands resting lightly on the table. But the tension that had defined him earlier had shifted into something quieter, more controlled, not resistance, but adjustment. And when Naomi finished outlining the final condition, she did not add anything more. She simply let the silence return, not empty, but structured, filled with the weight of everything that had just been placed before them. And for a moment no one spoke. Not because they did not have questions, but because they understood that what she had presented was not an opening for negotiation in the traditional sense. It was a framework, something to accept or step away from. And one of the directors finally broke the silence, his voice steady but lower than before. "These terms position her as the controlling force," he said, not accusing, not resisting, just stating what had become clear. And another director nodded, more slowly this time. "They also protect the system from interference," she added, and the distinction mattered, because it reframed control not as dominance, but as stability. And Naomi stood there, her expression unchanged, not defending the structure, not explaining it further, because she understood that clarity did not require repetition. And Edward's gaze moved briefly across the board, reading the shift, the acceptance forming, not through pressure, but through understanding. And then he looked back at Naomi, his voice measured, quieter than before but carrying more weight. "You built this to operate without us," he said. And it was not a challenge, not even a question, it was recognition. And Naomi nodded once, acknowledging the truth of it without emphasis. "Yes," she said, her tone calm, so that it would not depend on being accepted. And the words settled into the room with a different kind of gravity, because they removed the last illusion of leverage, and Edward held her gaze for a moment longer, then exhaled slowly, the sound controlled, and he leaned back slightly, not withdrawing, but creating space to think, to recalibrate fully. And when he spoke again, his tone had changed in a way that no one could ignore. It was no longer shaped by control, but by clarity. "Then our position is simple," he said, and the board turned toward him, not out of habit, but because the moment required alignment. "We either enter on these terms," he continued, "or we explain why we chose not to." And the line echoed her earlier words, not as imitation, but as acceptance, and the room felt it. the final shift, subtle but complete, and one of the directors nodded firmly. "We do not explain later," he said, more decisively now, and another followed. "We move now." And the agreement spread quickly this time, not forced, not hesitant, but clear, and Naomi watched it without reaction, her posture steady, her presence unchanged, because for her, this was not a victory. It was the expected outcome of a process she had already completed long before this meeting began, and Edward leaned forward again, his hands resting on the table, his gaze steady on Naomi. "Then we proceed," he said, and the words carried a different kind of authority now, not imposed, but aligned, and Naomi nodded once, a small motion, but one that confirmed the transition from possibility to action, and she reached for her tablet, not to adjust anything, but to finalize, her fingers moving with quiet precision, and the room watched, not out of uncertainty, but with the understanding that the decision had already been made. They were simply stepping into it, and for a brief moment, the tension that had filled the room at the beginning of the meeting seemed distant, replaced by something quieter, more focused, more grounded, and Naomi lifted her gaze one last time, meeting Edward's eyes, not as an opponent, not as someone seeking approval, but as someone who had already moved forward and was now allowing others to follow. And Edward held that gaze, not resisting, not testing, just acknowledging. And in that silent exchange, something settled between them, not spoken, not formalized, but clear, that the balance of power had changed, and that it had not come from force, but from certainty. The room did not erupt after the decision. It settled, quietly, like something that had finally found its place, and Naomi did not smile, did not celebrate. She simply stood there for a moment longer, her tablet resting lightly in her hands, her posture unchanged, as if nothing about this outcome surprised her. And across the table the board members began to move again, but this time their movements were different, not reactive, not uncertain, but deliberate, purposeful, notes being finalized, messages being sent, the quiet machinery of execution beginning to turn, and Edward remained seated, his gaze still on Naomi, not as an obstacle anymore, not as someone to evaluate, but as someone he had finally seen clearly. And that recognition carried more weight than anything that had been said out loud, and for a brief moment, the noise of the city outside seemed to press softly against the glass walls, distant, muted, as if the world beyond the room had continued unchanged while something inside it had shifted completely, and Naomi lowered her tablet slightly, her fingers relaxing against its edge, and she took a small step back, not withdrawing, but releasing the space she had held from the moment she entered. And no one stopped her, no one called her back, because the decision had already been made, the alignment already established, and she turned slightly toward the door, her movements calm, unhurried, as if she had nowhere else she needed to rush to, because everything that mattered had already been set in motion. And Edward watched her, and for a second, something in his expression changed, not visibly to everyone, but enough to shift the air around him, and he stood, not abruptly, not to reclaim control, but simply to meet the moment as it was. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than it had been at any point in the meeting, but it carried farther, because the room was no longer resisting it. "Ms. Carter," he said, and Naomi paused, not turning immediately, just enough to acknowledge that she had heard him, and then she looked back, her gaze steady, her expression composed, and for a moment, there was no tension between them, no conflict, just clarity. And Edward held her gaze, not searching now, not testing, just present, and he said, "You did not come here for approval." And it was not a question, not even a statement meant to challenge. It was recognition, and Naomi nodded. Once, a small, quiet motion. "No," she said, her voice calm. "I came to see if it was worth offering." And the words settled into the space between them, not sharp, not confrontational, but final in a way that did not need to be emphasized. And Edward exhaled softly, the sound controlled, and he gave a slight nod, not as concession, not as defeat, but as acknowledgement. And the board watched, not with tension, not with expectation, but with a quiet understanding that something had just been resolved without needing to be declared. And Naomi turned back toward the door, her steps measured, the soft sound of her heels against the floor barely audible against the stillness of the room. And as she reached the threshold, she paused for just a second, her hand resting lightly on the handle, and the light from the hallway spilled in, softer, warmer than the cold brightness of the boardroom, and she did not look back again. She simply stepped through, and the door closed gently behind her. The sound quiet, but definitive, and inside the room, no one spoke immediately, not because they had nothing to say, but because they understood that whatever had just happened did not need to be explained. It needed to be carried forward, and Edward remained standing for a moment longer, his gaze resting on the closed door, and then he turned back to the table, his posture composed, his expression steady, but something in his presence had shifted, something quieter, more grounded, and he said, "Let us not waste what we were just given." And the room moved, not with urgency, but with purpose, because they knew that what they had almost missed was not just a deal, it was a moment, and those do not wait. And outside, Naomi walked down the hallway without looking back, her reflection moving alongside her in the glass, steady, uninterrupted, and for a brief moment, the city beyond the windows caught the light just right, and everything looked clear, not because it had changed, but because she had never needed it to.